Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm excited to be speaking all things shared mental models and player development, player understanding, game development with Amy Price. Amy, great to see you.
Good to see you, Dan. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you back on the Sports Psych Show. This is a return visit for you. Let's start where we always do. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm currently a coach developer at the FA. So specifically working with coaches in the senior women's professional game. So that's Women's Super League, Women's Championship, first teams and under 21s. So that's a full-time role. Been doing that for just over 4 years. And previously to that, I was based in a university. So I was programme director at St Mary's for their PE and sports coaching undergrads. At the moment, I'm also still coaching. So when I first took on the FA role 4 or plus years ago, I kind of stopped coaching because I realised, I'm not sure I can fit this in. And then I was really lucky that about 2 years ago, I had an opportunity to actually coach, and the club were particularly flexible to kind of just realise that I can't be there every single session. So I'm really lucky that I'm currently coaching as well in a boys' academy. So that's really, really helpful for me personally, professionally, because just get to test ideas and test what works and just remember what it feels like to coach and keep working on those skills. So that's been really good. I'm also nearly finished a PhD. So I did it part-time. So my viva's in June. So basically it would have been nearly 7 years it would have taken me on a part-time basis. So I'm really proud that I've stuck that out for 7 years. And so that PhD is in game understanding. So specifically within team sport, football. Most of my research was conducted within boys' academies. So working with players and coaches in those contexts to establish lots of things underpinning game understanding. And that's kind of it, really, in a nutshell.
Life is busy. PhD, coach development, and coaching.
Yeah, it is. And actually, something I want to add that I've been doing recently is some coach development in other sports.
Okay.
Because I suppose I've been really, really exposed to football in my journey as a coach and coach developer, and just of late, probably in the last year, I've been seeing what it's like to do coach development in other sports. So that's also been quite interesting because I guess what you've learned in one sport, you're kind of figuring out how that works in another sport, but also how best to interact with those coaches and how to understand the context that they're in really quickly, considering it's really out of my comfort zone.
I find the same. You've made me pause there and reflect upon my own practice. I mean, my background coming from golf and having been a player and a golf coach. And definitely one of the things that pulls me out of my comfort zone. So as a sports psychologist, you know you're going to work in multiple sports. Of course you do. But when you walk into a new sport and you're not familiar with the language, it's useful in as much as it's uncomfortable. You're not familiar with the language. You're not familiar with the specific challenges necessarily that players face. But of course, there's going to be some repeated challenges across sports. Of course, human beings are human beings. But you do step out of your comfort zone when you walk into a different environment. It sounds like you're finding the same.
I think that thing on language is really interesting because I guess when you're in your sport, you don't sometimes realise that you're speaking that shared language with one another. Whereas when you're plonked into a different sport, you're like quickly having to decipher what things mean and just lots of like contextual information that you haven't been exposed to before that you've got to quickly pick up on so that you can have like meaningful interactions with the coaches.
Have you found that's had a positive effect on your capacity to develop coaches in football?
That's a really good question. I haven't thought about that before. I'm not sure yet. I probably need a little bit longer to establish that. but it's, I'll definitely
Yeah.
probably be looking out for that now.
Yeah.
And thinking about it more.
Yeah. One question, and you kind of alluded to the notion that this is the case. You stepped into a coach developer role at the English FA, and you at the beginning didn't think you had time to coach, but you were given an opportunity to go back into coaching. And as I say, you've kind of alluded to the fact that this is true. Do you feel that you can be a better coach developer by coaching as you're developing others? You're continuing to experience the specific challenges coaches face.
100%.
Yeah.
Because I think when I started the full-time role in coach development and realised I didn't have time to coach, I kind of accepted it. I was like, okay, that's fine. I recognise that coaching isn't coach development, and that's fine. I'm going down a coach development route on a full-time basis, and I'll commit to that. But after a couple of years, I did feel like, am I not as relatable as I could be? Am I not empathising as much as I could be?
Okay.
Have I not got enough current examples that I could have? And then when I went back into coaching alongside the coach development, 100% I feel more valuable to the coach. I feel like I've just got more examples to hand if needed. Like I can really empathise much better with the situation that coaches are faced with, and there's a credibility piece in there, I think, as well.
Yeah. For
a coach to have conversations with a coach developer, knowing that they are also on the front line themselves. Especially, I think, if you work for the FA in particular, because obviously it's a massive NGB, it's relatively well resourced, and there could be that perception that sometimes if you work for the FA, you're a bit disconnected with the realities of what actually happens in a football club on a daily basis, and the challenges and the dilemmas and the issues and the everything else, because you're kind of protected from that when you work for the FA in a way, because you drop in and out of clubs and you're not truly part of that club and you don't truly understand exactly what's going on a daily basis. So I think for the coach to know that you're putting yourself in that position, working with players, and by the way, not claiming to be the best coach in the world and just trying to do the best that you can do, I think that's really powerful for the relationship between you and the coach. And despite what level you're coaching at as well. So for example, I do coach development in senior women's game, but I coach in boys academy. So even though there's really completely different contexts, we're talking not just different gender, but we're talking like professional footballers who are getting paid, who are looking to win games. But then from a coaching perspective, I'm working with like kids, talented kids. Like, it is really different, but I don't think that matters, because I think you're still coaching, and it still offers a credibility factor. I think it still offers, it keeps you sharp as a coach developer, just to kind of like, empathise and recall situations that could start a great conversation.
Let's reverse that. Are you a better coach now for the experience you've had in coaching development?
Definitely. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Because I've been really fortunate in coach development to learn from so many different coaches. Despite who they're coaching, like, it doesn't matter, I'm still learning so much. And it gets you to think more deeply about coaching practice when you're a coach developer, because I guess your role is to notice, to ask questions, to provoke thinking. So it gets you thinking more. And I suppose as a coach developer, it's not about what you think, it's more trying to support the coach to establish their beliefs and rationales. But in the back of your mind as a coach developer, you have your own views.
Yep.
And if asked, you'll share them. So I think it also helps to reinforce what you think by being a coach developer. So therefore, when you step back into coaching, I think you've just got a little bit more most of the time you've got a little bit more of a rationale, a little bit more of an understanding as to why you're doing what you're doing, and probably like a broader perspective of like different ways of doing stuff because you've seen so many other coaches work across so many different clubs.
Before we get on to the main topic of conversation today, I just want to return to this briefly because as you were speaking, I was thinking of one more question to ask you about your experiences as a coach developer working in other sports. You're a football, soccer coach developer. That's your main sports. As you mentioned, you've walked into other sports and striving to develop coaches in other sports. I'm thinking of the main specific knowledge here. Is it startling to you how much domain specific knowledge is important to coaches, or do you think coaches should wear their expertise lightly? Is domain specific knowledge in sport really, really important, do you think?
When you say domain specific, are you referring to the sport?
Yeah, I'm. Yeah, sorry for the vague question. I suppose I'm saying if you walked into a golf scenario or a tennis scenario, or just another sport.
Yes, I think knowledge of the sport is crucial. Like, I think you need to understand in a lot of detail, depending on
Yeah,
the players you've got in front of you. I think you do really need to understand the sport
yeah,
that you're working in. I obviously don't come with that understanding and knowledge when I walk into these other sports.
yeah, and that's the challenge.
Yeah, so for me, it's first of all like not trying to pretend that I do. So kind of embracing the fact that I'm
Yeah,
a novice in this
yeah,
particular sport at the moment, but I'm willing to learn and I'm
yeah,
making an effort to find out more. I think that's the first thing. And then kind of like using my knowledge in the other areas to stretch and support the coaches. So I might not have knowledge of the sport, but I would like to think I have some knowledge of like pedagogy, for example. Um, and then maybe the coaches, you'd like to think, have the knowledge of their players and the knowledge of their sport.
yeah,
So between us,
yeah,
we can hopefully
yeah,
have some really meaningful conversations.
yeah. You're going to facilitate that process.
Yeah.
Absolutely fascinating stuff. And we're here today to talk about a paper that you actually did completed some time ago. I think as part of your PhD. Would I be correct in saying
Yeah.
that? Because your PhD is about player game understanding, and so this paper you did alongside Professor Dave Collins. It's entitled "Contributing to a Coaching Team's Shared Mental Model of Player Game Understanding: An Intervention Within High-Level Youth Soccer." There's some big concepts being thrown out at me here in this title. Game understanding, this is 7 years of study for you. Shared mental model is something that I'm often talking about with coaches in my own psychology consultancy practice. Before we dive in here in granular detail, tell us a little bit of the genesis of this paper. You know, where did this start? Where did the interest in this topic start for you? How did this fit into your PhD? Yeah, give us an overarching picture here.
So the paper before this,
Hmm.
study that we done before this, was looking at coaches' perspectives on game understanding.
Yeah.
So we looked at a number of boys' academy coaches from like foundation phase to PDP
Hmm.
to establish how they interpret this notion of game understanding. And one of the findings from that piece of research was it's not that clear. Even though game understanding is a commonly used term within football,
Yeah.
there wasn't a lot of consistencies in terms of what these coaches consider this to be. What makes up game understanding? What does it look like? How do we know? So as a result, we thought actually let's zoom in on like a coaching team at one club working with one particular group of players to figure out like what's their start point. So what do they currently perceive as game understanding?
Yep.
And then we basically, it was an intervention study. So we worked with them to try and enhance their shared understanding of game understanding to then establish whether that had impacted or not. So yeah, it was basically because initially it was quite mixed, and therefore we wanted to find out if we could improve it.
And so, take me through first steps here. I mean, can you define game understanding for me? What do you mean by game understanding in the context that you're speaking to here?
Oh, big question. It's weird, isn't it? Because even after like 7 years, like I'm still searching for a term, a simple definition of what it might mean. I think game understanding is about learning how to outwit your opponent.
Love that.
So I've drawn upon, obviously, a lot of the TGFU literature suggests outwitting the opponent is fundamental to playing games. So yeah, learning to outwit your opponent. Obviously, you can. There's different levels to that, isn't there? You know, you can go quite deep with that. So if we were to go with that definition, I suppose it's then, do we notice it? Can we see it happening? Because on a football pitch, you're looking at the actions of the footballers, but you don't necessarily see their thought processes. So therefore, for coaches, it's interesting to understand what they're basing game understanding on. So when they're saying this player has high levels of game understanding, this player doesn't, what are you basing that on? And then furthermore, if you and I, for example, are a coaching team, are you basing it on something different to me, or are we basing it on the same thing?
And I'm guessing this is where this term shared mental model enters the scene.
Yeah, and this is really interesting for me as a coach developer, because out of all of the studies I've done for my PhD, I find this one to be the most meaningful for my practice, because as a coach developer going into, at the moment, first team setups, where typically you'd have a manager or a head coach who chooses the playing style and decides on how we want to play, what tactics, what strategies, etc. I've noticed that there's often a disconnect between what the manager has in their head and actually what the assistant coaches and the technical staff and the MDT, their understanding of that, because either it's just in this manager's head and it's not been clearly shared, or maybe it has been shared and there were some attempts to share it, but it's not quite landed, or there's those grey areas where there's incoherency between coaches and then therefore players not receiving consistent information.
As in the players, if there's not, I love that term coherency, and we had Dr. Jamie Taylor on talking specifically about talent development pathways, but I think you can align this across the board. First team talent development pathways, underage groups, that horizontal coherence is really, really important. So coherency across staff, that there's a danger if we don't have that coherence, if we're not singing from the same song sheet, if you like, then we can actually communicate mixed messages and have kind of dissimilar conversations with players, where players are receiving different instructions or viewpoints. Am I hearing you correctly on that?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think if a player is receiving that inconsistent or incoherent information, it's not giving them the best possible opportunity to demonstrate their potential and to perform at their highest level. So I think it's essential that coaches take responsibility for being on the same hymn sheet as you described it. Not to say there's no space for disagreement, because there absolutely is. But at the end of that process of disagreeing or agreeing, there's got to be clarity in what we're choosing to go after, and people buying into that within the coaching team and sharing that clearly with the players.
Otherwise, there's chaos.
Otherwise there's total chaos, yeah.
And I'm assuming those conversations really have to happen behind the scenes and not... I mean, I guess they could happen with players depending on the age group of players and getting the players' viewpoint as well. But I'm guessing that it's the sophistication of the conversation behind the scenes between staff that's important here, potentially, in order to get on the same page.
Yeah, I think it's about investing time off field with staff to have these conversations. Often, I guess, in clubs, it happens by accident. So we might, in a football club, for example, we might have a coach's office, and informally we might just start talking about football and start talking about the game at the weekend. And that's great, that's brilliant. But I guess we have to be mindful of who is and isn't privy to that conversation, because it might be that certain individuals from the coaching team aren't present, so they haven't heard that. And also, like, the nature of the conversation, like is it descriptive? Fine if it is, but at what point are we going to go a little bit deeper, a little bit more critical, a little bit more reflective, start asking some more probing or open questions to really start to test and challenge people's understanding of game understanding? Because especially if you're thinking about youth players as well, because if you consider the growth and maturation of these young players and how that can also affect what they do on the pitch, how they think, there's all of these other factors that can play into our understanding of game understanding and how we judge players' game understanding. So I think it's crucial to work time into schedules. Like the coaches probably need some dedicated time frequently to just talk about game understanding, because I guess it's not something you can just tick off and do once. It's something you need to keep on top of.
And we're kind of socialised in coaches, aren't we? As you mentioned earlier, we see the external. We don't always consider the internal that's influencing the external. It's kind of what I'm thinking here as you're speaking. And it's important to potentially have conversations with fellow coaches to be on the same page around those potential internal factors, the biopsycho factors that are being influenced by the social, I suppose, and the behaviour.
Absolutely, yeah. I think as coaches, we're drawn to the action on the pitch of what those players do in certain moments, which is also important, but we need to figure out and consider the process. So the thought processes that led to those actions. And I suppose that comes with, obviously talking to players and figuring out what factors influence their decision making. But then as a coaching team, being transparent with that and ensuring that everybody understands and is aware of these different factors that played a part into this player's decision making. And then I suppose to add to that, you have your time as a coaching team off field deliberately talking about this stuff. And then it's also about how does that translate on the field, on pitch. So, for example, how does our understanding of game understanding come across in the way we design practices, in the way we approach sessions, our session design, how we engage in feedback with players, all of these things. So it's the on and the off field, I suppose, where we need to be really clear and aligned.
So unpack this research for me a little bit. We've got the general purpose here. So take me through how you went about this, what you did, how you went about this in simple terms.
So the club that we did this research at was a Cat 1 academy with the under 13s.
Okay.
And there were 4 coaches. So these are technical coaches. We didn't include the wider MDT in this, but
multidisciplinary team.
Yeah, like we know that at academies there's like lots of other people that contribute towards the development process, right? Like S&C coaches, psychologists, goalkeeper coaches, etc. We didn't include those people, but we probably would like to do that moving forward. Just wanted to keep it simple to start with. So we had 4 coaches who worked with this group, and we basically asked the coaches to judge each player's game understanding based upon a interview transcript of each player talking through how they approached the game. And by that I mean we basically interviewed each player, asked them certain questions around certain aspects of the game, including some clips from a recent match that they would speak through.
Okay.
And then basically handed those transcripts over to the coaches, anonymised them, and said, we'd like you to judge each player's levels of game understanding. But what we gave them to help with that is a criteria.
Okay.
So there's a set of criteria which make up game understanding, which came from a previous study. So that criteria included playing in a style that represents the identity of the club, using game plans, game management, dealing with change, reflecting on and in performance, having a why behind game actions, playing to strengths, recognising opportunities to practice individual targets. And that was what coaches in this previous study had said they believe represents game understanding. So hence that's why we used it as our criteria in this study. And we basically said to these 4 coaches, read the transcript, go through each one of those 8 things and rank them like based upon what you believe. So like 1, 2, 3 or 4. Misunderstood the situation, poor understanding. 2 would be somewhat understood, limited understanding for this level. 3 is understood, sound understanding for this level. 4, fully understood, good understanding for this level. So they were going off that basically. And then it was a case of going, okay, what do we do now? We've got the coaches' scores. They were not coherent at all.
Right.
So what could we do to enhance the shared mental model of these coaches? So we basically did like a workshop with the coaches and used like questioning, started some like critical conversations, some like probing the coaches to like justify their scores for the players, to really just get them thinking in more detail really around why they've given players certain scores and what they're perceiving as game understanding. And then we did it all again after that. So then we said, okay, cool. Go back to the transcripts and do the same process again in terms of ranking.
And what findings did you have from that second process?
So it was improved. Like it was improved. Yes. Like I suppose it's kind of inevitable that it would have been improved, right? Yeah. Because we put it on the coach's radar. We've kind of gone, actually, we're going to have a conversation to see if we can improve coherency here. So therefore, coaches in that time period, which was 7 days, could have just been thinking about it more and talking about it more.
Yeah.
In addition to the workshop that they'd done with us. So yeah, it was improved. I suppose like the thing with that is it's something that can be implemented quite easily at clubs.
Okay.
Like I've described it as a workshop, but you can make that as informal as you really want it to be. I suppose it's just about creating the environment for coaches to say what they think, and somebody facilitating that, asking good questions, and the coach is just like listening and engaging. I think that's just a really informal intervention that could be used.
The first thing that struck me, and please excuse me if I'm sort of stepping away from this piece of specific research, but the first thing that struck me is the usefulness of taking your player game understanding elements and actually holding conversations with players themselves. You know, using each of the elements. I mean, that in and of itself is a wonderful starting point that perhaps, with respect, many academies don't do as effectively as they possibly could do.
Yeah, I mean, the interviews we did with players, the findings of that were shared in a previous paper, and I think it's the paper that we did a podcast on before.
You are right. I was, as you were speaking, I was thinking, we talked about that. Yeah.
I think that was the finding. So like, it was good to have those interviews because the framework of those conversations was applied cognitive task analysis, where we basically said to the group, like to each player, the first part was like, show me how you play out from the back, for example, and they would talk us through it on the tactics board. The second part of that interview was, here's a clip from the weekend's game, showing like you outwitting the opponent, talk us through it. What were you thinking? And then the third part of that interview was, here's an example of the senior team like being outwitted. What would you have done here if this was you? So we got them to do that, and it was recorded. And like the criteria that I've just described there was, we didn't show that to the players, but we basically like gave it to the coaches as a mechanism to judge players' levels of game understanding based upon the interviews.
Can you speak a little bit to the original conversation that coaches had? Their original assessment, you said it was inconsistent. I mean, I'm asking you, so I suppose, to tap into your memory here, but also feel free to tap into any experiences you've had subsequently. I mean, how inconsistent was it? I'm guessing there are some commonalities. Coaches are saying some things that are similar in terms of their assessment of player understanding, but can it really be different? Can it really be disparate? Is this a real problem in developing players? Is our real different perceptions of where they're at?
So yeah, some of the conversations that came out of the workshop, we started to get some clarity on the criteria. So for example, where we've spoken about playing in a style that represents the identity of the club, we started to break that down. So actually, well, what does that mean to this group of coaches? And again, that can be different. That can mean different for different coaching groups. But for this group, they were saying, for example, that means an appreciation of roles and responsibilities, like an awareness of how the unit and team link, knowing why we play in this certain way and not in a different way. Pushing the boundaries was an interesting one from this group. So they spoke about, we've got a playing style, but we can operate on the edge of that playing style at times, so that we're still within the style. So therefore, we're still supporting our teammates to predict our behaviours and to anticipate what we're going to do, be coordinated. But if we're on the edge of that style, we're also being a little bit unpredictable for the opponent as well.
Yeah.
So that was quite interesting. So that's what they came up with in terms of their interpretation of playing style. And then for each element, they've got their own interpretation. Like, for example, I thought an interesting one for youth players was around recognising opportunities to practice individual targets, because definitely within football, it's a thing, isn't it, in terms of individuals having their own plans, like knowing exactly what they're individually working towards, and for those players to recognise, yes, practicing that in training, but how and when would you practice that in matches? So this group of coaches said, well, in terms of that, it is them understanding when and why that they should practice these targets. So therefore appreciating the difficulty of the game that they're in. So like if it's a game or match against a top opponent who are playing in a certain way, causing certain problems, might not be relevant to practice your target in that moment. And they also spoke about like what's the implications for practicing this in this game. So if I do practice it, how's that going to help us to do X? Or how's that going to help my teammate to do Y? So yeah, I thought they were like, yeah, it came across with the group very thoughtful in terms of like them unpacking what each of the 8 criteria means to them.
It's interesting because what I'm hearing is out of the inconsistent lenses, it enabled them to actually brainstorm, well, okay, let's actually think about what this really does mean. You're sort of becoming even more granular with these themes or elements.
Yeah, definitely an element of brainstorming and checking and challenging. But those elements of those 8 elements, they are common terms. So it's interesting also to actually have realised that they weren't previously spoken about in that much detail.
Yeah.
So like I think that, again, coming back to the start of our conversation around when you're in a football environment or you're in a certain sport and it's a certain environment, how you take for granted like terms that are used, and we assume that one another have the same interpretation. But actually we haven't really like actually had that deliberate conversation on what we really mean by that, because we're assuming. But by doing this, it really kind of got them to verbalise what they think individually, but also to listen to their colleagues, and which in turn enhanced the coach's metacognition as well. Even though the whole process of the 7-year research project was to enhance the players' metacognition, we've actually enabled the coaches to do that through this process as well.
Metacognition being sort of thinking about their thinking about their.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I don't want to step away from this specific research, but again, it's got me thinking about one of the things I've found in my consultancy practice when I've been blessed to work, with great coaches and great teams, and those teams, whether they're academies or first team environments in any sport, where there's been a group of coaches, not just say one grassroots coach, even though this is completely applicable, where there's been a group of coaches. I've learned over the years, I suppose it's still my opinion, but I've learned that one of the most important head coach is the group of coaches they choose to have around them. And it's made me thinking, it's not just I'm a head coach, I have a philosophy, and I want my coaches, to come in and help me drive that philosophy. It's also maybe having initial conversations, and there could be a lot of conversations here around defining terms, defining philosophies, defining elements like we're talking about together, so that as a coaching unit from the very beginning, there's a shared mental model, there's a shared lens of the world. I know I'm not specifically talking about game understanding, although it could be related to game understanding, but defining definitions is defining certain elements is really important, isn't it?
100%, yeah. I think naturally coaches might have these conversations more when it's regarding the football.
Yeah.
As in, like, how we want to attack or how we want to defend and what we'll do in this situation. And, like, that defining and, like, getting clarity will probably happen more when it comes to the football stuff, which is obviously key, but just as key, especially when you're in working with youth players and you're making decisions on how you choose to develop these players and what their futures might hold, is talking about game understanding, because we can't just judge the players on their actions on the pitch. We have to also be taking into account everything else that's informed their actions on the pitch. So I think, yeah, just probably not taking it for granted in terms of common terms we hear in football clubs, but actually, what does that mean for us? And actually putting time in our diaries together to actually unpack it is the biggest learning. And it seems really simple, right? I've said that and it just seems like so simple. But that is the biggest learning that I've taken from this process, that I feel could have such a quick and big impact in coaching contexts. And interestingly, I've actually found myself in a situation with the club that I coach. I mentioned that I coach in the boys' academy, and literally have like used some of this process in this research paper in practice at this club regarding one of the players that we have. And I suppose it all started because this particular player was being judged by, different members of the MDT in terms of his actions on the pitch.
Okay.
Potentially not displaying the level that the coaches and members of staff would like, but then tapping into, firstly, the psychologist, the performance psychologist in that setting, and trying to develop some mechanisms with this player to establish his thought processes and refine his thought processes so that his actions on the pitch were more efficient. And in it kind of, it was weird because I felt like I was living out this research paper that I'd done previous, but I was like, wow, this is actually, I'm using this now. This is like, I'm having to use this in my context to support this player's development, to support the coaching team to get on the same page with all of this stuff. What we mean by X, what we mean by Y, why are we making these certain judgments, what's informing those judgments, utilising the skills of this performance psychologist, because she is really good at asking questions, listening to the response of the player, to really delve into his thoughts, his feelings, his emotions, and providing him with a framework when he's on pitch. So, like, what might he be doing before he receives the ball? What might he be thinking when he is in possession of the ball? And then what next? So all of these things, and I was like, wow, this is the research in action, just maybe not as full, not as formal, and not as like intense, but parts of the research were happening in my context.
You nicked my next question there, because I was going to ask you about how this research, you had mentioned that this research had impacted, or this specific research had impacted you the most. I'd just like to dwell on that because you've unpacked that really well for us, but perhaps we could go even more granular as keeping it surface level, because as ethical as you can go here. What, and I suppose asking you to be a little bit vulnerable if you don't mind, what specifically did you do? I understand what then happened with the psychologist and stuff, but what specifically did you do that maybe you wouldn't have done prior to this research?
So I think I paid more attention to how the player might be thinking on the pitch to start with. So this player might, for example, if they're working on out of possession and their job is to defend the goal and win their 1v1s, but this player wasn't achieving that in terms of the actions, like clearly show that the attacker is getting the better of him every time, then my first thing, what I think I'd done differently, was to pay more attention to why. What's the thought process? What was going through the mind of that player? So when you might do like reviews or debriefs or analysis with individuals, I found myself asking more open questions, such as what led you to that decision?
Okay.
What factors were you considering here before you made that tackle? Or what did you notice about your opponent that made you choose to defend like that? So I was trying to ask questions which gave me insight into his thought process. And again, listening really intently to like his responses and trying not to have an opinion as such. I'm genuinely wanting to like be curious and understand his rationale. And I think if you've got a good relationship with the individual, you might be able to pick up on some subtle information that could suggest, or it could like take you down a bit of a path with them. So like stuff you didn't know, stuff I actually didn't know that you felt like that. So for example, an individual might say, I felt really under pressure in that game because I didn't know that you felt under pressure, or actually I'd received some information from a coach the week before and he said that I should. So I did. And I'm like, okay, I didn't know you received that piece of information from that coach. Okay, that's interesting. So like just trying to pick up on as much as I could. And then I suppose it's like the next bit in terms of how you then influence the coaching team. So I might have had a conversation with that one player and picked up on quite a lot of information regarding his thought process and his feelings, but then how do we as an MDT like use that information, take that information seriously, and like think, okay, like what next for this player? Like how can we support this player now? We know this stuff, and be on the same page with those strategies, what we want to try and support him with. So whether that's something linked to how we design practice, whether that's something linked to how we debrief with this individual, or whether that's something linked to how we give feedback during matches to this person, like just being on that same page. And then also like holding us account to that, because we could do all of that, but then we could still end up just making judgments on actions and forgetting about all of the stuff that we said we would do. So it's like just maintaining the commitment within the coaching team that we said we would like, and all of this being underpinned by a shared understanding within the coaching team of what led or what leads to certain actions on the pitch from this certain player and how we can help this player better.
I love your descriptions over the last 3 or 4 minutes, and I want to share with you what I've heard. And there won't be a question here, but I'd love to get any comment you have back. I think as a sports psychologist, maybe I'm biased. Maybe it's my cognitive bias, but I think of sport by and large as technical, tactical, physical disciplines that have biopsychosocial wrappers around them. And listening to you, the process of your, whether you describe it as the process of your PhD, doing each research paper on game understanding, which you could put primarily within a tactical sphere, but it definitely has that envelope of biopsychosocial. And because of your experiences doing the research, there's some serious biopsychosocial factors going on here that I've heard. I've heard that you suspended your judgment and initial interpretations you may have had from the actions that you saw. you focused your attention on maybe some of the inner processes that this person might be experiencing, and so subsequently you decided to ask questions. You listened, you were curious at the thought processes they were experiencing. You then took time to communicate this with your fellow coaches to build a shared understanding. Listening, attention, communication, shared understanding, thought processes, judgment, interpretation, all these biopsychosocial factors enveloping game understanding, technical, tactical, physical, however you want to describe it. No, as I say, Amy, no question, that's kind of what I'm hearing you say, and you feel that's a move forward with your coaching. You're perhaps a more dynamic coach as a consequence of this research.
I think so, yeah. Yeah, and I think probably the added layer on top of that is, but we still want to support this player to improve their actions.
Yes.
It's not like it's
Yeah.
just about the process,
Yeah.
and it's not just about refining how they think, how they solve problems, how they
Yep.
reflect. Yes, that's key, and all of that will shape our judgments on their overall game understanding. But it's also the execution. So, like, it isn't that we're forgetting that. So it's like focusing on the process to hopefully result in better execution in the end is probably where I've gone with this.
You're being a greedy coach, essentially, player centered, but also tech tac driven. You're trying to improve their football, but doing it in a manner that considers them as a person.
Yeah, I think so. I suppose the challenge with all of this as well is that's just my personal perspective on coaching.
Yeah.
So then when you're working in a wider team of coaches, it's how do we all buy into that? Should we not? Maybe we shouldn't. But I suppose like the player needs clarity, and the player needs to receive consistency and coherent information from his coaches.
Yes. I'm mindful of your time, but where I want to finish this conversation. So you mentioned that you had a psychologist who facilitated, at your own academy, facilitated this process or helped you facilitate this process. And in the research paper, I suppose as a sports psychologist, I would say you generously suggested that, sports psychologists can offer great value in terms of, again, facilitating a meeting amongst coaches, asking those questions, listening, reflecting back, those kind of the psychologist toolkit, if you like, in terms of broadening conversations so they become as meaningful and as sophisticated as possible. And so my final question to you is this: you're a coach developer for the FA, and I'm sure I know you function quite, you're functioning at the very highest level of the game as a coach developer. There are thousands, tens of thousands, however many grassroots coaches who still perhaps have, a colleague or two colleagues in their club who they're working with. I'm assuming you'd agree that coaches themselves can do this. They don't need a psychologist necessarily to be able to have these more open conversations.
Yeah, definitely. I think it starts with the FA and the education that the FA provide to coaches throughout their journey. So I think maybe that's something we could enhance, is developing coaches' skill sets when it comes to learning. So like you said, asking really great questions, being good at listening, etc. Like how prominent is that in coaching badges or in coach development programs? It's probably become more prominent of late, but it's not traditionally what you'd expect to learn on a course, for example, with the FA, because mostly it's football based, so technical, tactical, Obviously, there's some skills in there like practice design and everything like that. And it starts with the FA to actually highlight these skills as essential for any coach. But then also recognizing that, like, the grassroots coaches you described there, who haven't got all of these specialist people in their coaching team, they do come with skill sets that they've probably developed over time in life or in their other career. So I suppose it's like coaches just using the skill sets they've come with, and if they recognise gaps, then it's probably just like actively trying to practice that stuff and knowing that it might feel uncomfortable because it's different for you, or like it doesn't land how you wanted it to because you're still practicing it. It might not feel like it's worked straight away because you're still practicing it. So it's like, I guess, just committing and keep trialing things out and seeing how it works.
Brilliant stuff. Amy, thank you so much for this. This has been really, really interesting and a wonderful follow-up to our previous conversation. So those two research papers really do go hand in hand. One follows the other. So I urge people to check out my first conversation with Amy. Amy, how can people follow you, find you, get in contact if you wish to be gotten in contact with, and potentially read this fantastic piece of research?
So my Twitter is AP Grey Matters UK. So that's Professor Dave Collins' company, Grey Matters. And then also my email is amy.price@thefa.com.
And in terms of reading the paper, is it in a specific journal or is it accessible?
Oh yeah, it's in a specific journal, but for people that don't have the access, they can just contact me and I'll send it to them.
Perfect, brilliant. Amy, thank you so much for today. That was really interesting.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. I'd love to hear any opinions that you have. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.